And now that you know a bit about hashing and JSON Web Tokens, let's start integrating that into the To-Do API. The first place we're going to integrate that is inside of our post users signup call. Currently, we do not return an authentication token, which is not cool. The user shouldn't need to sign up and then make a separate login request. They just signed up. Give them a token back. Now, we could indeed put all of the code for generating this JSON Web Token right here inside of our Express route handler, but we're going to be reusing this code in multiple places. Both the sign up and login Express routes, they're both going to require this functionality, so it makes a lot more sense to break this out into a reusable method that we can take advantage of in both. There are two types of methods we're going to be exploring in this video. We're going to be exploring model methods and instance methods. Model methods are called on the uppercase U user object, and instance methods are called on an individual user, like the new user we just created right here. A good example of an instance method we'll be creating in this video is a method called generate auth token. The generate auth token method is going to be responsible for adding a token on to the individual user document, saving that and returning the token so we can send it back to the user. This requires the individual document in order to work. We can't generate a auth token if we don't have access to things like the user ID and access to updating that individual user so we can add the token to its tokens array. Your model methods, on the other hand, do not require an individual document. A good example of a model method would be something like find by token. Find by token doesn't exist inside of Mongoose. Find by one does, find does, but find by token is going to be a custom model method we're going to create. It's going to take that JWT token that the user sends in one of their secure requests. We're going to find the individual user and we'll return that user to the caller. Both of these are going to be really useful in getting authentication done. For now, though, we're going to stick with just creating our generate auth token method. Over inside of the user model file, before we can even do that, we do have to make one quick tweak. Now, the tweak I'm about to make, it's not going to update the functionality of the app at all. We're simply restructuring our app for flexibility. In order to add on these methods, we have to switch how we create our user model. I'm going to delete this commented out code as it's no longer useful, and we're going to make a variable called user schema. The user schema variable is going to store the schema for a user, which means it's going to store all of the properties kind of like the ones we've defined right here. Now, I don't mean kind of like, I mean identical to. Right here, we're going to set user schema equal to a new schema. In Mongoose, that is done by using the new keyword, going on to the Mongoose object and accessing the uppercase S schema property. The schema property lets you define a new schema, and this is what we need in order to tack on these custom methods. We can't add methods onto user, so we have to switch how we're generating the model. Now, the schema constructor function, it takes an object, and on that object, we define all of the attributes for our document. We actually have all of those defined right here. We can literally take this object, cut it out, and replace it right here. Now we have our schema, and the only thing we need to do to restore the old functionality is pass it in as the second argument, user schema. At this point, we have made 0 changes to the functionality of our application. We've simply restructured, allowing us to add on these methods. To create a method, right below where we define the user schema, I'm going to add something onto user schema.methods. User schema.methods is an object, and on this object, we can add any method we like. These are going to be your instance methods. In our case, we're going to be adding an instance method called generate auth token. Your instance methods do have access to the individual document, which is great because we need that information in order to create our JSON Web Token. Now we're going to set this equal to a function, but as you'll notice, I'm not going to be using an arrow function. I'm going to be using a regular old function with the function keyword. Now, as you've noticed throughout the course, I've mostly used arrow functions. Arrow functions do not bind a this keyword. We need a this keyword for our methods because the this keyword stores the individual document, which means that we can actually create a variable called user setting it equal to this. By doing this, it's a lot more clear exactly what we're manipulating. Instead of manipulating this, which could be anything, we're simply going to be manipulating the user, which is an identifier that we're used to in other places in our file. Now that we have access to the individual document, the document where the method was called on, for example, this document, we're going to be able to define what we want to do. Over inside of user.js, we can now fill this out. We need to get an access value and a token value in order to create the new token inside of the document. First up, access. Really simple. A variable called access, which gets set equal to the string auth. Nothing fancy there. Next up, though, we are going to be making our token variable, which means we're going to need to use that same JWT sign method we used over in the hashing file to generate the token. Before we can actually call JWT sign, we do need to require it up at the very top of the file. I'm going to make a constant. I'm going to call this constant JWT, and we'll set it equal to the return result from requiring JSON web token. Now that we have JWT in place, we can call it down below, setting the token equal to JWT.sign. We're going to call sign with those two arguments. The first one being the object that has the data we want to sign, and the second one being some secret value. We're eventually going to take this secret value out of our code and move it into a configuration variable, but for now, you can add some secret value. I'm going to use ABC 1, 2, 3. The actual data we want to sign is, first up, the user ID. I'm going to create an underscore ID property to store this value, and we can grab it off of user like we would anywhere else in our server file. User dot underscore ID dot to hex string. We want to pass in the string value as opposed to the object ID, and the other property we're going to be adding on is access. I can use ES6 to add the access property, setting it equal to the access variable, which is the string auth. Now this returns our object I'm going to call toString to get back our string token. Now all of our data is generated, and all we need to do is update the user tokens array. It's a regular array, which means we can use regular array methods to manipulate it. What I'm going to do is call user.tokens, which is an empty array by default, dot push, which lets us push on something new. In this case, we're going to be pushing on a new object with those two properties, access and token. We have access and token variables defined right here, which means we can use the ES6 object definition syntax, specify access, and specify token. A few students have reported running into issues using push. Push was causing problems when they actually ran the script. And I dug into it a little bit, and there are some inconsistencies across MongoDB database versions. So what we have is a new line. What I'd like you to do is replace that push line, the one we just wrote, with the second line shown here. Here we get the exact same thing done, adding a new item. We just do it via the concat method as opposed to the push method. And this does work across a wider range of versions. This is the method that I recommend you use. So swap out this line and that's it. Let's go ahead and jump right back in. With this in place, we now have changes made to the user model. The last thing to do is actually save those changes. Currently, we update the local user model, but we do not save it. In order to save it, we're going to call user.save. Now, user.save, as we know, returns a promise, which means we can call .then. Right here, I can pass in my success callback function, and all we're going to do is return the token. This is the variable we defined above. And we're going to do this so later on in the server file, we can grab the token by tacking on another then callback, getting access to the token, and then responding inside of the callback function. Now this then statement, this is going to happen in server.js. In order to allow server.js to chain on to the promise, we're going to return it right here. Now you might never have seen this done before. Usually when you return to chain in a promise, you return another promise. In this case though, we're just returning a value, and that is perfectly legal. That value will get passed as the success argument for the next then call. In our case, we are done with the user.js file, and we can move on to server.js, actually generating the token by calling the method and adding it as a header. I'm going to save this file, and over in server.js, we're going to kick things off right inside of our save callback. Instead of responding right here, we're going to call that method. We're going to call user.generate auth token. It doesn't take any arguments, so we won't call it with any. Then we can go ahead and return it, since we know that we're expecting a chaining promise, and we can tack on another then callback. I'm going to add a second then callback right here, and this is going to get called with the token value. Now we have everything we need to make the response. We have the user and we have the token. Right here inside of our then callback function, we're going to respond by calling response.send, sending back the user. Now we've already added this part of the code. It was done up here, and you'll notice the user variable that we sent back is not the same as the user variable defined here. Up above, we used the user variable, which was the argument to then, but this value, this is identical to the one up here. And I don't mean that the actual objects have the same value. I mean they're literally the same exact thing in memory, which means we can simply remove the argument right here. This just clears up what's happening. It doesn't change the functionality at all. Now it's really clear that we can go ahead and send back the user because the only user variable is defined right here. Next up, we have to add on that header. We have to send the token back as an HTTP response header, which is the real goal here. To do that, we call .header on the response object. Header takes two arguments. The arguments are key value pairs. The key is the header name, and the value is the value you want to set the header to. Our header name is going to be x-auth. When you prefix a header with x-, you're creating a custom header, which means it's not necessarily a header that HTTP supports by default. It's a header that you're using for specific purposes. In our application, for example, we're using a JWT token scheme, so we're creating a custom header to store that value. Next up, we can go ahead and pass in the value, which is just going to be the token argument up above. With this in place, we can now remove the old commented out response, and we are done. In order to test that everything is working as expected, we're going to start up the server and fire off a few requests over inside of Postman. I'm going to start up the server by running node server/server.js. Once the server is up on port 3000, we can move into Postman and try to sign up a new user. I'm going to use the post users method, and I am going to be updating the email inside of the body data since this email is already in use. Instead of Andrew, I'll use Andrew ABC. Now I can go ahead and send off this request, making sure I'm on the to-do app local environment. And what do I get back down below? I get back a 200. Down below, you can see the entire user document, which for the moment is a problem, but we'll fix that in a second. We have our access value, the token value. We have a unique ID for this object, all inside of the tokens array. Over inside of the headers tab, we can also see the response headers that came back. And right here, we have our x-auth value. This is the JWT value that we're going to need to send with our secure requests, like posting a to-do, getting to-dos, or deleting to-dos. That'll be done a little bit later, but for now, we do indeed have the token getting sent back. Now, one thing we can take care of really quickly is limiting the data that comes back when we convert one of our instances, one of our users, into a JSON value. There is a toJSON method available that we can actually override, which means we can only send back certain values. For the case of a user, we really only want to send back the ID and the email. We should go ahead and leave off things like the password and the tokens array. These are secure properties that should never ever get sent back to the user because they have no reason for them. In order to do this, over inside of Atom, we're going to override a method. Previously, we created a method. We created the generate auth token method right here, but we can also override a method to update exactly how Mongoose handles certain things. User schema.methods is going to be where we store this method once again, and the method is called toUpperCaseJSON. This method, which we're going to define as a regular function, determines what exactly gets sent back when a Mongoose model is converted into a JSON value. In our case, we're going to first grab the value, then we'll use the _pick method to actually pick off the properties we want to send back. First up, I'm going to make a variable called user, setting it equal to this, just like we do for generate auth token. Then we can go ahead and create a variable called user object. User object is going to get set equal to user.toObject. User.toObject is responsible for taking your mongoose variable, user, and converting it into a regular object where only the properties available on the document exist. Now that we have this user object variable, we can use pick. I'm going to return lodash.pick, picking off some properties from the user object, and the properties that we'll be picking off will be inside of the array _ID, and as the second item in the array, email. This means we'll be leaving off things like the password and the tokens array, which should not get returned. We are going to need to import Lodash up above since we're using the pick method, const _ require Lodash. Awesome. Now we can go ahead and restart the server and make a new sign-up request and see what data comes back in the response body. Over in the terminal, I'll give my server a quick restart. Then inside of Postman, I can go ahead and change the email to something that doesn't exist, like ABCC, send off the request, and down below we get a 200, and this time we get a trimmed version of the document. We only get back the user ID and the email, which is exactly what we wanted. Over inside of the headers section, we do still get back the token, which is great. This is what the user is going to need in order to authenticate later. With this in place, we are now done. The sign up method is looking great. It knows how to sign up users and knows how to generate these auth tokens. Since we have something meaningful complete, let's go ahead and make a commit to our Git repository. Over inside of the terminal, I'm going to shut down the server and run git status. Right here, you can see we have our changed files as well as our new file. I'm going to run git add to add all of those to the next commit and git commit to actually make the commit. Add, post, users route, and token method. Once the commit is made, we can go ahead and push it up to GitHub. I'm going to avoid deploying to Heroku for the moment since there's nothing Heroku specific we need to test out yet. We'll deploy to Heroku a little later when we actually have a couple routes complete. That is it for this one. I will see you next time as we continue on with authentication.